This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to this latest in our series of seminars. I'm delighted to introduce Duncan Scott. And I was thinking as I came here, how am I going to introduce this man? Because I've known him, well, first of all, I was trying to work out how long I've known him and decided that was a fruitless speculation. Duncan's been around pretty well as long as I can remember being involved with the voluntary sector. He's been part of the stalwart group of people who established the idea that voluntary organisations were worth researching, worth teaching about. And he's had a second life in which he's been a community activist. I think it's a reasonable description of your activities. So when he's not been in the ivory tower, he's been down at the grassroots. There's two cliches to the price of one.
Yep. There's more to come.
There's more to come. I'm delighted he's here. I have read the publication, which is the backcloth to his talk, and I'm looking forward to hearing him
Waffle.
Yeah. Discourse.
There you go.
Discourse. So Duncan, it's over to you.
Thank you. Well, there is a book, and I know that no one wants to buy it, but I have got leaflets you could pretend to take away and make into paper aeroplanes and so on. It's been a long time coming, 17 years. I get distracted and write other books instead. It's self-published, partly because I got so tired of thinking what else I wanted to do. Please be critical in a constructive sense, but just as an aside, this is my first public live presentation about it, and so it'll probably have its incoherences even more than my normal incoherences. It's going to be a problem because anything that took 17 years in the making, it's a social biography of a woman called Margaret Hill, née Haig, then Bunn, then Hill, who was born in 1919, but the time I want to look at is when she'd come out of Somerville College, Oxford, in 1940, having gone there in 1937, and she spends some years in Manchester University Social Administration Department, which I ended up being head of about 20 or 30 years after her, after she'd gone. I'll come to how I found out about her in a minute. I suppose the problem of getting 17 years into 45 minutes is a familiar one, and the necessary compressions and so on, so you're just going to have to grill me at the end about things that are clearly not very clear. Even if we had all day, there's a certain sort of audacity, even foolishness, I think, about wrenching some general conclusions from a very dense, complex and singular life. I think this story is a very compelling one, but I wouldn't I? It's interesting because when I was writing about her, I found out all sorts of connections with other people. She went to Somerville College, Oxford, and somebody called Pauline Adams has written a history of Somerville College, Oxford, and she talks about the celebrities who went there. And that's, I've found out, the sort of thing you'd expect when colleges and universities write about themselves and their history. They write about their celebrities. So Margaret Thatcher gets a lot of space, etc., etc. The only person who isn't a celebrity who is mentioned at all in Pauline Adams's book is our friend Margaret Haig, Hill, Bunn, or whatever you want to call her. Somehow or other, she gets in everywhere. So on to this first slide, which intrigues various members. It was taken in 1937 by a man called Humphrey Spender, who was part of the upper class dilettantes who went to Bolton as part of the very first wave of mass observation. And what they called Bolton was Worktown. And this was one of the very first photographs that Humphrey Spender took. It's a standard northern cliche, as far as I think most of us are concerned. I was brought up in the shadow of one of these mills, and how daft can you get? Notice the cobbles, no clogs though, no shawls. It's clearly a textile mill It's not a weaving mill, it's a spinning mill. It's not there anymore. There are about 40 women in the picture and 2 men. Cloth cap, though, to preserve some of the cliché. I introduce it like that because there are all sorts of nuances and ironies in the book. Slightly above is the phrase that she kept using in a vast wodge of autobiographic materials that I found when I started to dig into her life. But she was never just slightly above, given that she got 5 scholarships to Somerville, got a unique first and a double blue at Oxford, then got a prestigious postgraduate fellowship to go to Manchester, and by the age of 22 had already written several articles about voluntary sector development in the early war years in the northwest of England. The bit of her life that I want to look at, Margaret, Haig as she was when she first went to Manchester in 1940, she was, in the end, after about a term of being a postgraduate student, she was jointly appointed, this was an interesting one, to the so-called Department of Social Administration. There were only 2 people in it, her and another person who'd been to Somerville about 5 years earlier, who at the time was called Barbara Stancliffe. There were hardly any men about as students or staff. Most of them had been conscripted. It was a period of what I call the pre-professional period. So there was no, for instance, their exam papers, which had the title Soc Admin on the top, had virtually to exist without any courses, because there were no courses called social administration, yet you could get a degree in it. It was quite intriguing. It was the early days. You did a bit of economic history, you did a bit of psychology in the name of social science, you did a bit of history, you did a bit something called commerce. There was even a whole course on the cotton textile industry in this emergent faculty. So there was a scarcity of men, so it raises questions about gender and perhaps the special territories that she got into in her life in the 1940s in Manchester. And there were clearly very porous institutional boundaries, because if she was jointly appointed, what she spent several years doing with her slightly older sister, as it were, as I call them, inverted commas, was going up and down what's called Oxford Road in the centre of Manchester to the Council of Social Service. Some days they'd be there all the time, some days they'd go back and forwards, and so on. So that was part of her early days. So I want to look at and raise questions about whether or not there's more than just an historic specificity about her life. You know, as you could say, in using the usual historical approach, not I think very subtle, well, it all depended on the wartime. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been jointly appointed, she wouldn't have done the research that she did, she wouldn't have got the kind of roles that she ended up taking very quickly before she was 22 in this big thing called the Council of Social Service. The men would be there, she'd get crowded out, and therefore it's only of interest as a sort of historical relic. Whereas I would argue, hopefully, if I get that far and you don't walk out, I'd argue that there are some general implications of this little section that I want to look at. Incidentally, the whole book is called The Making and Remaking of a Social Researcher. Just as an aside, the making bit is what I want to talk about. How was she made to be a researcher? Not an exemplar in the sense of best practice, but interesting practice with implications. And why was she remaking herself as a researcher? Well, the reason is between the words making and remaking was her descent, what she calls her journey downward. She, for a whole mix of reasons, ended up being a homeless wanderer in the lanes and byways of southern England for 12 years. And there's a great chunk of her time, from all this, if you like, climbing the academic ladders period in her life, in her very young life. She had a major mental breakdown in the 50s and into the mid-60s before she was gradually, if you like, rehabilitated. And then, and I'm now going to talk about, if I can make it move on, the sources and what I collected and how I began. The first chapter is called Nearly Meeting Margaret, because in 1997 she appears in a small monograph that was published by the department I just finished trying to manage, as a token of esteem for the older Somerville sister that was her mentor. And this sort of statement of esteem by in this monograph had three worthy professorial characters, men, one of whom was Nicholas Deakin, who voluntary sector people will know about. David Donison was there, and a man called Jonathan Bradshaw. But before you get to these three worthies, you get 4 or 5 pages called My Life with Barbara by Margaret Haig. And I came across this because I was being asked to help disseminate this thing free to people who were interested. And I thought, this is peculiar. Why is this unknown woman bursting onto this dignified thing? There's a whole lot of stuff about how important this Barbara was. Because when she died, this Barbara, she was in the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the Independent, pages of stuff about how important she was in the history of social administration and social policy. But there's this little aside about a couple of years in the early 1940s, and it's Margaret Haig. So I wrote to her. And within 2 days, I got a reply in an A4 brown envelope that had been heavily reused with stuff that she'd written in the 1980s, autobiographical and retrospective. I thought you would be interested. If you're interested in my little piece that you have just seen, perhaps you'd like to see all this. So I replied, and she replied, and I replied, and she replied, and this went on for 6 years. And we got to the point, and the first chapter has got examples so that you can believe me when I say we went from Dear Dr. Scott to Dear Duncan Scott to Dear Duncan, and perhaps we'll be friends and you can come and meet me and we'll do some work together. And then she died a week after her last letter at the end of 2003. So that was how I started. I then started to look for perhaps colleagues, but there aren't many of those around. But I ended up in Somerville College having lunch with somebody who was in the same history set in 1937, 95 going on 96, must be 100 or so by now. And then I found students of hers in the early 1940s, and it's a sort of snowball thing. Here's another rogue coming in. There's an old... Hello, Mike. And it turned out that the more I wrote to this woman who was living in an untidy flat in Exeter, she would send me diaries that had got 70 or 80,000 words in them for 1 year only in 1942. She sent me something like 100,000 words over the 6-year period. I had to get it, photocopy it and send it back quick with a £5 note wedged in the thing to pay for her stamps. This was her instructions, please slip something in on the reply. And what I was able to do then was to compare her early writings, her making as a social researcher in this Council of Voluntary but Joint Appointment, with her subsequent retrospective, because she did write some interesting stuff in the 80s, which through a former, if you like, classmate of the year of 37, who'd ended up being a senior lecturer at an Australian university education department, and she has a whole series of them published in little autobiographic chunks. And again, some of them are about her research in a voluntary sector agency. And what all this made me think about was the social in social research. And here's this woman who gets a first in history in 1940 at the age of 20. She'd gone to Oxford or had passed the exams at the age of 17. She passed her 11 plus at the age of 9. She went to 4 secondary schools for all sorts of reasons, 2 of which were residential. Certainly not working class and near the weavers, but she'd picked up all sorts of unsponsored, non-formal learning on the way. And I just wanted to, if you like, with all the risks that involves, share 3 or 4, if you like, little pictures of the unsponsored spaces and put them alongside all the time in the library, all the essay writing, all the study of the kind of PPE Oxford of late 1930s, and so on. Now, I got to this point in preparing this talk, and then I fell upon Anne Oakley Nee Titmus, his latest collection of essays, which apparently were published not long ago, certainly somewhere in the autumn of last year. Fascinating collection of essays because her dad gets a fair savaging in them for all sorts of reasons. What I was struck with, I was thinking that what I'd written about was an historic thing, that it was all about the 40s, or it was about the 80s, or whenever it was. But here's this thing that's just been written a few months ago, or published a few months ago, that says what Anne Oakley calls the history of the Girls' Network is only just beginning to be written. Because I don't claim to be a great expert on feminist perspectives on social life or whatever. I have a dim sense, and my wife keeps beating me over the head with it to try and make it a bit less dim. And I was surprised and sceptical about the notion it's only just beginning to be written. It seemed to me a challenge which I hadn't really dealt with, and probably just as well I hadn't read Anne Oakley's book before I published this, otherwise I'd probably want to start rewriting it. But then she talks about an informal mentoring system, and I was fascinated by this. So as another little aside, I'd sold a copy, one of the rare occasions when I sold a copy, to a friend, and he said to me after he'd read it, he said, "That's interesting, you know, that stuff about the 1940s in Manchester." He said, "My brother's just co-written a book about Manchester University in the Second World War. And by the way, he's rewritten part of that in a grand coffee table book about that's where I spent most of my life, as it were, it seems, in Manchester University. There's a grand coffee table thing, hundreds of pages of coloured pictures, and lo and behold, there's another version of his brother's writing about the Second World War. Fascinating stuff, because lo and behold, these books that I then started to go off in, propelled, as it were, by Anne Oakley's assertion that it's only just beginning to be written, there's an informal mentoring system, it's a male-governed public world. Maybe this is familiar stuff, but it's the just beginning to be written that struck me. Well, anyway, the first book about wartime Manchester University was full of pictures of male students being taught how to use Bren guns. Then there was a section on the fact that the men were all called up. Then there was a photograph of an all-women graduation day, but the caption read, "The men were all at war." It didn't say what the women were doing, it just assumed that you knew they must have been studying away in the library, and therefore they were going to get their degree. And I thought, well, this is interesting because it seems to be confirming, because these are recent publications. And then there was this coffee table book that repeated the kind of assertions about Bren guns and all women graduation days, but it was not clear what the women had been doing. Because if you weren't at war with guns, then you kind of were behind the curtain somehow. There was no home front. Now, of course, there's lots of books written about the home front, and in a sense, the point of getting a bit further into this is this woman, Margaret, actually did a major piece of research on the home front via the Council of Social Service. What, in fact, the coffee table book did was it had a special section on women, celebrity women, and half a line about one of the women that was relevant to Margaret's upbringing in the faculty. Half a line that said X, somebody called Frances Collier, who was the faculty secretary and a research fellow and so on, and very important for several decades in Manchester University's history, created a feeling of awe and respect, quotes, and then that was the end of her. Nobody else got mentioned, except the Russian sniper who had come to Manchester University to give a special lecture in 1942 to encourage people to open up the second front, and so on. And if you don't know all about that, well, never mind. But so you get a feeling, I hope from me, that I'm beginning to put away my surprise and scepticism about the just beginning to be written routine, and the notion that, well, certainly all of my research about this woman indicates that there was an informal mentoring system, and the world was continually male governed, even if most of them were somewhere else. So what I wanted to do was just explore with you a handful, or even less, yes, a handful of windows, if you like, into where the social might have come from, because I'm never very sure where the social comes from, having spent 30 years or so teaching qualitative research and social research to social policy and sociology students. Not quite sure where it all comes from. And the first one is a sort of tease about the slightly, because this is called the Institute. It's been knocked down now. It's adjunct to what was the Greenfield Mill in Darwen near Blackburn. And it's where Margaret's parents were recruited to by a Quaker philanthropist, owner of the mill. He'd built this institute. It's like a kind of early community centre, and he opened it in 1925, just at the same time as the Elmhursts were buying Dartington Hall, almost I think at the very same month. And Margaret's parents were brought in as caretaker, bottle washer, canteen director and so on. And it's a symbol to me of how slightly is a sentimental reflection by Margaret, because Dad read the Manchester Guardian, and Mum and Dad were obviously singled out from their church Christian socialist network in nearby Burnley, and this man, Percy Davis, the owner of the mill, had sought them out and pulled them in to Darwin. And what he ended up doing was sponsoring the 9-year-old Margaret, when she was 11, 12, to go to a succession of Quaker residential schools in the north of England, both in Lancashire and Yorkshire. It's also interesting that this same mill and this same institute was where Gandhi went when he came from India in 1931. It was alleged, and I sort of allude to that in the book, that he probably went to that mill because he'd get a better reception, because he was, in a sense, likely to get some stick if he went to one or two other mills that weren't quite so Quaker-oriented, because, of course, he had put a ban on various kinds of exports of cotton and imports of cotton and so on. But anyway, this is where, if you like, the learning begins. And I make no apologies for that kind of what looks like a rather mundane quotation. You may not know what dandelion and burdock is, or sarsaparilla, but then that probably dates me. But you do know what bars of chocolate and packets of players are. And this is I think, what I would want to say about this, and why I've deliberately done it like this, is my kind of stricture is beware an underestimation of the importance of the mundane in anyone's learning about the social. Because what she did, and what she says in her vast autobiographic writings, her retrospection, is that she was picking up the activities and the speech patterns and the interactions of largely male clientele who were coming and going in and out of the institute, getting meals that Mum had provided, taking part in various games of cribbage or table tennis. In the summertime there were games on the field at the back of the institute and so on. And she was wrapped up in all of that, even while she was flogging away, earning her 5 scholarships to Somerville College, Oxford. So while she was, if you like, going down the formal, being made into a researcher route through the library work and the passing the exams and so on, this was the beginnings, for me at least, and symbolises something about beware the underestimating the mundane. When she gets to Manchester University, she's already been at Oxford. She's been playing hockey for Oxfordshire. She's shortlisted for England, but she never quite makes it at hockey. She gets a blue at cricket. She gets this first in history, and so on. So clearly there's a lot of socialising going on there. But in her first term at Manchester in 1940, in July 1940, when she just turned 21, she gets sent on to a fieldwork placement, and they called it practical work. And this one was in the university canteen just before Christmas. And she did a couple of weeks with a friend who had also been at Somerville, who'd come up with her to share a one-room flat in the middle of Manchester. And again, I quote selectively, of course, from the writings. But the point about arriving and leaving in darkness, coal miners, weavers, and so on, is that these people who came and worked in the canteen worked shifts. And one of the things that they kept saying was that if you weren't on the right shift, all the good stuff had gone. And what they meant was, because it was rationing, in other words, it took, particularly in my opinion, women to experience that, because who did the shopping? The women did most of the shopping, and what they complained about was always being on the shift that finished at about 6 o'clock in the evening. So people who went into the textile mills or came out of Humphrey Spender's photograph were always jostling to be on the shift that allowed them to come out at a different time. And the second thing, this was Margaret's friend, Sandra. Sandra was on the pie squeezing machine, putting the tops on the pies. And she couldn't get it to settle down on the pie properly because it was, in her terms, it was designed by a man for a man-sized hand. What they were beginning to do in the spaces that they were thrown into in the name of social administration was respond to their experiences via their particular gendered notion. They were learning something about the social side of research, practically, directly. You'd call it participant observation if you like. But what I'm building up to is a number of experiences that they had before Margaret is sent out into the darkest abyss called Manchester and Salford Docks in 1941 to 42, where she does a giant piece of research for Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour. But she does it via the joint appointment. Now, the bigger picture about the joint appointments in the 1940s seems to me, I want to break down into three layers. The first layer is about the disciplinary status or the state of development of the disciplines. And what they all did, these people who wanted to be social admin people, there were only about 10 of them in the end because all the men got conscripted, was they had to do a course in social research taught by a professor of psychology called Tom Hartley Peer, spelt Pear, P-E-A-R. And he had written a chapter in a book which apparently, as far as I can tell, was probably the only textbook on social research in the late 1930s. It was called The Study of Society, Methods and Problems, and was edited by Bartlett and others. And if you ever wanted a paper version of this waffle, then there's a bibliography. And I could do that via Michael or whatever in a week or two. But what struck me about Professor Peer and Bartlett's introductory 2 chapters in the book, and there's about 15 chapters, is how much stress they put on the idea that people who were in the higher education academy would welcome the active cooperation of the amateur investigator. This seemed to me quite interesting because it recurred and recurred. It wasn't that the high priest wanted to come down from their lofty position, but they were prepared to welcome in contributions from the people who hadn't been so privileged to have gone to Somerville or Manchester or wherever. And that is a theme, I think, that's part of the bigger picture. What was the status of the disciplines or the interdisciplinary spaces that they were in at the time? And then, clearly, the fact that they were jointly appointed, so easily it seems, indicates the nature of the porous institutions. Because Pear was not only the professor of psychology, he reappears in the Council of Social Service, chairing the research committee. So he's going up and down Oxford Road as well. And then you find out there's actually only 2 people in the psychology department, Pear and one other. And you find out there's only 2 people in the social administration department, Barbara and Margaret, plus the active help of the faculty secretary, Frances. And Frances is interesting, Frances Collier, because she, and I'll come to a particular piece in the Manchester Guardian to illustrate her role in all this, was constantly writing letters that got into the Manchester Guardian because of her connections with the editor, arguing for the employment of women. And what she said, and this is, I think, rhetoric rather than reality, now the barriers are down. It was one of her slogans. So the joint appointments, if you like, more specific picture takes place. You won't be able to read that, I don't think, clearly, but what it is a mock-up of the display board that was at the particular headquarters of the Manchester and Salford Council of Social Service in the early 1940s, because the original photograph is even more blurred than that, and this is a mock-up of it. And if you were able to count them, there are 14 or 15 agencies, and symbolically, the Council of Social Services is on the 4th floor. And there's a missing floor called the basement, where they made the tea and the sandwiches, and then came up a rickety lift with Mr. Maguire helping them open the doors, these metal framework doors and so on. So here they were in the crossroads of Manchester's voluntary organisations in the early 1940s. And the whole story of this joint appointment is of a mix of the internal encounters dependent on which floor you got out at and who was going up the lift at the same time or coming down it and so on, and all the external links that connected this, if you like, strategic place at that time. And one of the strategic places was in the construction of this report, which was part of what was called the Nuffield Reconstruction Survey of the 1940s. And what G.D.H. Cole and his mate Lindsay, who was the head of Balliol College, what they were doing as a couple of chaps overseeing all this, a lot of women writers, but they wanted to know how voluntary social services were going to respond when the war was over. And they started the work in the early 1940s, and it took them until 1945. I've amended, if you like, this frontispiece of the book. And in the foreword to the book, there's the remark how they, the two dignified, very important people, of course, G.D.H. Cole and Lindsay, were thanking over a wide range of general help Barbara Stancliffe, who became Barbara Rogers, and by this time our friend Margaret had made her first disastrous liaison by getting married to somebody she'd only met for 3 weeks, who was twice her age, and it all fell apart, and terrible, terrible carry on, hence the beginnings of her journey downward, somebody called Bob Bunn. What's interesting to me is that in Barbara's diary you get the real story of how Miss Bourdillon went about getting information. She came off the train in Wilmslow and went straight to Barbara's sofa. And there they had Dubonnet and a bit of lime and talked endlessly into the early hours about the business of the voluntary sector. That was the way in which Miss Bourdillon constructed relationships and then became part of the informal mentoring network, if you like, building upon the informal mentoring network that was already there in Manchester. So this was another window, if you like, but my favourite window about the girls' network and the informal mentoring is the work of Francis Collier, who was the faculty secretary. Now, what the left-hand column says, Sir, your article in today's da-da-da-da-da-da Guardian. It's not your article at all, it's Francis Collier's article, but it's called By a Correspondent. But Francis has got a deal, she's got a deal with William Percival Crozier, who is the editor of The Guardian, so that she can write a reply to her own article on the same day that her own article comes out. And Crozier, paper shortages, I've read all this, is saying, sorry I can't give you a real copy, but this is the best I can do. And I found all these in a yellowing pile of papers in the back room of my rather dingy Manchester University social policy room in the department. And just as they were about to be thrown out, I took them all home, fought a battle with my wife, stuck them in the attic, and then about 10 years later opened them up, and here these were pinned together with a pin. And there's another one, you see, in the book, the original article is on the left-hand page, then there's this, then there's that. And to me, this is the business of the informal mentoring network at work. Francis is so sufficiently close to somebody who also did history at Oxford in another college, part of the metropolitan elite, that's what we'd call them up in Manchester, clearly very anxious to, if you like, advance this young person who's coming in her joint appointment. And Francis's original article ends with the references as follows: manual skill counted for little and intellectual ability for even less, but now the barriers are down. Well, Francis was going to make sure that some barriers were down because of the joint appointment that Margaret got in the Council of Social Service. What I was able to get out of the many correspondences with Margaret was the fact that one of the first things that she had to do was edit this distinguished journal. This came out several times a year for the princely sum of 6pence. Well, it sounds very little, but of course 6pence was, you could buy 3 loaves of bread, 4 pints of beer and still have change from a farthing, and whatever it was in those days. I will remember it well, he said, lying through his teeth. And this is something that, I just found fascinating, because she wrote a series of articles about voluntary sector activity and had them published in this. Had them published. She was the editor, she was the reviewer, she was the person who wrote some of the articles. In one case, in October 1943, she wrote the whole 30-odd pages. She had links to the printer, she had links to the subscribers, she just about did the lot. and yet she'd only been out of jail, as it were, called Somerville College History Seminars, etc., for about a year. But she was propelled into this by her Somerville big sister and Frances Collier, who persuaded the male head of the Council of Social Service that she was the greatest thing since sliced bread. She wrote in the end 4 published articles which would, if you like, not be out of place in contemporary journal articles. They weren't brilliant, they weren't full of references, but they were certainly, if you like, they're certainly worth looking at the very least. And what the springboard from these were that she had to service, as a secretary, there were actually subcommittees, these 3 subcommittees. And the key one was the research one, Professor Tom Hartley Peer. There was a dame who looked after the library committee, not a dame at the time, but she quickly became one. And it's important, I think, that you could see that there's a kind of more or less formal place inside the voluntary sector agency that was giving her opportunities, and she was either responding to them or she wasn't. But I think one of the most important things that she did was to make sandwiches. And the luncheon club, and you might say, well, why dwell on the luncheon club after all that, that distinguished build-up, 3 subcommittees and doing all this work with the Social Welfare Journal? Well, think about it. 2 Somerville female graduates down in the basement making cucumber sandwiches and brewing the tea and then carrying it up and down and so on once every 2 or 3 weeks. 4 an agency directed by a man and chaired by a man, one of whom, of course, was the very distinguished Dean of Manchester, who thought our man, And I think what we're talking about here is how the luncheon club in particular was a place where much of the political and welfare elite went. And there were 50 to 60 people would come to this in the 1940s for all sorts of reasons. There weren't alternatives. The elites were overlapping much more than, because there weren't professions in the way in which we developed. There wasn't a welfare state. There wasn't a well-defined set of institutional boundaries that separated out the town hall from the commerce, from the church, from the welfare, from the university, and so on. It was a much less formal, it was a much larger and wider constituency, and it enabled her and her big sister to begin and to build and to maintain a set of social relationships that took her from the luncheon club to the docks. Now, she ends up at the age of 22 in the midst of 2,400 men on Manchester and Salford docks at the height of the Battle of the North Atlantic. 100 odd ships had gone down. They weren't turning the boats around fast enough. Somebody found out. Bevan had sent somebody up because he was bothered about this. He'd sent somebody up and found that there was something like a 20-odd% absentee rate in the docks at the very height of the war. The ships weren't being turned around fast enough. What's going on? And Manchester Ship Canal Company, as it was then, was persuaded to find the money to pay for an expert. And what Frances Collier and Barbara Stancliffe did was to bluff their way into getting Margaret accepted as an expert, when all she'd done was some desk research in the Council of Social Service. But the Council of Social Service was her kind of imprimatur. It was the thing that gave her just a tiny grain of credibility. And she describes how she bought a suit and a hat and went along and bluffed her way into this job. And she worked then, along with her big sister and another network, Frances Collier and others, firstly doing covert, as we'd call it now. She used the wonderful word incognito in the docks canteen, hence the connection with the food again. Because one of the things she did was to study the way in which the canteen worked. And what there was one canteen at one end of these docks. And her report is fascinating because she says parts of the docks were 25 to 30 minutes away from the canteen. Now work it out, you've only got an hour for your lunch. And she worked it out. I mean, it doesn't take, as they say, a Nobel Prize winner to work out that it was totally dysfunctional. The night shift weren't allowed access to hot water because it was considered they didn't need to stop for a cup of tea. if they went on night shift. She found that as soon as the lights went out at night and they had to work 3 shifts a day, there was a tin with a red cross on it in the policeman's hut. That was the first aid and health and safety equipment. And it took, if you like, this rather strange, somewhat introverted 22-year-old and her big sister, and her other big sister, Frances, to begin to winkle out these patterns of who was feeding, what was the nature of the commercial dockside cafes and so on. And in the evenings, they wrote a little diary about doing the rounds of the dockside pubs. And this is where she wrote her piece about my life with Barbara that got into this monograph that started my trail. And she talks about them getting into this double bed together and having to run home to get cleaner sheets because it was all so dirty. It's a bit sentimental, but it's fascinating reading because the original is in the archive in Manchester Reference Library. And they got a group of volunteers, some students and some members of the Council of Social Service, to sample the meals of the different dockside cafes. And if it was 8pence, it was this kind of meal, and the most expensive meal was, I think it was 12p or whatever they call it then, it'd be 1 and 2pence or something like that. And it was all about comparing them. And just as another slight tease about her, their favourite pub was the Salisbury, which is was just down the road from Old Trafford football ground. It's not there anymore. They talk about it in hushed whispers almost, metaphorically, but actually it was the most distinguished pub in the dockside area. It was where you went if you went to the races in Salford. But it was a symbol in a way, as far as they were concerned, because everybody else was a man. There weren't any other women there except 1 or 2 ladies of the night, and these 2 characters who thought they were being, if you like, invisible with their Oxford background from the university, having a gin and tonic or whatever it was, and everybody else is having watered down beer and so on in the Salisbury. So, I'm running out of time maybe. I'm going back to Anne Oakley again and asking the question about putting the social into social research. And I'm asking myself the question, are we really quite ignorant, what does that mean, about the connected histories of women who are involved in applied research? Do you think my account belongs only to a particular historical time? Because part of me thinks, after about 50 years of messing around in the voluntary sector, is it likely that the social contexts of voluntary organisations and community action require a particular, at least, gender sensitivity, even if you're a man? Because there's a disproportionate number of women who are involved in the voluntary and community sector, something like 2 out of 3, at least, if not more. Sometimes almost all the main actors in voluntary agencies and community agencies, certainly at the lower levels, where it's almost entirely volunteer, are women. Maybe there are peculiar issues involved in researching many of these settings that require certain sorts of fluidity, certain sorts of processes, and maybe there are issues about the social into social research. It's one of my hobby horses about where does the social come from? How do we prepare ourselves as academics, or how do we prepare students under or post grad in terms of social research? I mean, I can remember my PhD preparation. My very good supervisor of the old school said, just jump in. That was his approach. And there was one book in the 1960s when I started the PhD, which had an account of, it's called Street Corner Society by William White, an account of doing work, because I did street corner research for 18 months. And he hadn't even written his appendix about the research methods then. It took him 30 years after the book was first published before he got round to it. But I think there's an issue about whether or not we know enough about, or we've spent enough time writing about how we put the social into social research. It's a research about social life, but whether it's social research in terms of the actors who are doing the research. Now, I say this partly because I've just spent the last 5 or 6 years mentoring, if that's the right word and it doesn't sound too arrogant, the people in the Third Sector Research Centre in Birmingham University who were tasked with doing the qualitative research into voluntary agencies and accompanying them sometimes in and out of these over a period of 5 years. And what struck me about a lot of the tensions that they found themselves in was they were caught in various, if you like, dichotomies, contradictions, which I'd like to spell out or explore a little bit. See, I think at the very least I have to have a degree of agreement with Oakley's conclusions, which require me to think about curriculum development either at an individual or a collective, either at an undergrad, postgrad or furthered professional development level. And it may be that I'm doing it far too simplified, so I'm bound to say, as a way of trying to avoid too much criticism, of course we want to get beyond dichotomies. So it's not formal or non-formal, it's not men or women, it's not the business of whether or not you come out of your ivory tower or you stay in. Although I have to say that I was first appointed to Manchester University after 74 I was in an education department, and I moved across the road to Faculty of Economic and Social Studies in 76, and I was appointed to direct field work, and it said you needed no special something or others. That's why I got the job. But within about 2 years there was a major debate went on in the department, quite a big department, and several people who've since become giants of social policy writing and professors all over the world and so on set up a working party, of which I was a sort of reluctant and a feared member, which asserted, and I sort of paraphrase, but it's in the book, the exact words, they said, there is no longer any need for students to do field work. There is now enough literature in the libraries, there is no need for them to see for themselves. Now that's an interesting philosophical position at least. It's an ideological position, I think, at least, and I disagree with it entirely. But then in a sense it depends what you want to do. Depends what kind of research you want to do. But clearly what they did in Margaret's time was to chuck her out and say, go on, you can do it. You're a joint appointment, you can get some people around you, you can set up this journal, you can write some articles, you can chat them up at the luncheon club, you can go into the university canteen, you can experience the meals, you can experience the journeys on the buses in the mornings. One of the things they found in the Doc's research was that if it rained, more people got a bus, but there weren't any more buses. So some people couldn't get on them. So some people didn't bother to go because they thought, well, stuff this for a bunch of bananas, I'll go back home. Because it was 2 buses, one in and one out again. And no one had actually worked this out until Margaret and Company, with a few volunteers and some from the voluntary sector, had got on buses from different corners of the compass, if you like, and just done it on dry days and wet days and come up with these stunning, mundane, social, direct experiences. So I think what I'm about is saying, what's the appropriate balance between being mindful of the formal training that many of us have got in the name of doing social research, particularly about voluntary sector agencies. What can we learn from Margaret's life and times? What can we learn from being more aware and more sensitive to the kind of things that Oakley pushes us to consider? She's saying we're quite ignorant, and it seems to me she's saying it about men and women who read her essays. So given that she's a very distinguished writer, I want at least to try and explore how relevant that is. And I think that what I've found in relating to the Third Sector Research Centre people was the business of how difficult it is sometimes to find enough space for the social. In other words, what I found was that you appoint people to do research in higher education institutions, usually after they've got a PhD and they're in their 20s and they've just got married and they've got a child at home or something like that. They've got constraints. There's only certain things you can expect them to do. Because you see, my bottom line here is that people who are sponsored and trained and experienced often have to rely on a second-hand relationship with the research world. This is what happens to people who go up the academic ladder. You're lucky enough if you get a bit of money somewhere and you say, well, I'll appoint a researcher and send the person out. Well, even the person who is sent out, my experience at Birmingham was, usually have domestic constraints which prevent them from doing the kind of things that the textbooks say you ought to do about getting in and going incognito into dockside canteens and pubs and so on. But the social spaces I'm interested in is people often get out and do research, but they interview or use a questionnaire. And I think that's such a narrow use of the social space that's available for the person who's going out there, because you hardly ever, major generalisation, please attack me with words, people don't write about the fact that pie making machines are difficult to use. They don't write about dandelion and burdock and sarsaparilla and players and chocolates. They don't write about being incognito in the works canteen. They write about the words they've exchanged in formal interview and questionnaire spaces. And it seems to me that's not enough, because it's not a social space except between the interviewer and the interviewee. The real social space surely is the context within which, in the docs world, people try to get to work, people try to have a meal, people try to get first aid help. Within 12 months of Margaret's research, they'd constructed about 5 or 6 mobile canteens. And then they said, oh, well, all right, you can have hot water in the night. Oh, all right, then we'll see if we can get sandwiches at night time. Because of the casual labour that was coming in from poor, inadequate boarding houses where they weren't getting fed at all. But I think in the end, and because I want to get to the end and have a bit of a crack with you, we're all joint appointments, not in the formal sense, in that we all occupy professional spaces alongside personal ones. Now this sounds pretty corny because it's dead obvious, isn't it? We all have homes to go to. We all have family and friends and neighbours. We're all members of associational networks. But when you come to ask people about how these, if you like, personal, non-professional, non-sponsored, if you like, what I call contexts and ecologies, the unsponsored strengths, how much do we draw upon them in the way in which we operate as researchers into the voluntary and community sectors? And I think we don't draw upon them enough. One of my favourite anecdotes, it's a bit corny, is the concept of the Curriculum Vitae. And I think there's more curriculum and not enough vitae in the CVs. Because if you look at the CVs, there's one classic CV which I've got in my files, which has about 2 pages of boxes for previous education, secondary education, tertiary education, further research, publications, blah, 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 and then right at the end, with about 1/4 of an inch, it says other. Now I think that other ought to be another page on everybody's curriculum vitae, because there's no life for the social to grow, which is in a sense, it's inhabiting, but it's invisible, it's inhabiting all these other layers, all this qualificatory stuff. But, I only got a PhD because I'd fallen out with a long-time girlfriend. That's my story. Because I was spending 20 hours a day sometimes bumming around. And I think people need to be able to be honest about the social context in which they operate. And what Margaret's massive autobiographic deluge, as I experienced it, demonstrates that there are tensions and contradictions between the sponsored strengths and the unsponsored strengths. But they need exploring and they need rebalancing. There will be costs because Margaret became a Jill of all trades. It's interesting how we all tend to use the word jack of all trades. Well, what Oakley's telling us is we ought to talk about Jills of all trades. The problem about being a Jill or a jack of all trades and master of some, I would argue, because I think that's a silly dichotomy, when you try to have a range of skills, when you try to bring more social into the research, is that you tend to increase the overload. My experience after, it's about 35, 36 years in higher education, and most of that's been associated with field work and placementing and qualitative research and long-term research in 1 or 2 or 3 places, is there are some payoffs, there are some costs and some benefits. And sometimes you find yourself in too many places at once. But I think there are some, if you like, more universal challenges for us, And I think that Margaret's time in the Council of Social Service offers us some windows into what these tensions are, and that they are of continuing relevance. I'm going to stop there.
All right, thank you.